Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Andrea, and I'll be your host for today. If you're not familiar with what we do here, we bring science, exploration, and conservation into classrooms around the world. We host between 30 to 50 live events a month, so make sure you're tuning back in to see if there's any others that interest you. So today is International Sloth Day, and we're celebrating by joining Lucy Houliston, who's Vice President of the Sloth Appreciation Society. So her background is in TV production, and she's traveled all over the world documenting many types of wildlife, but she's got a particular love for sloths, which is what she's going to teach us about today. So welcome in, Lucy.
Hello.
Hi, it's great to have you. I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay. So, as Andrea mentioned, today is International Sloth Day. So that's why I'm here. I want to tell you all about sloths, which are officially the world's slowest mammal, but also, I think, one of the world's weirdest mammals. So to everybody that's watching, we want your questions. So at the end, I can answer some of your questions. Maybe you've heard a fact. Maybe you've got a fact that you want to share as well, or you've heard a fact and you're not sure whether it's true or not. Also, you can share those with me at the end. But if you think of anything while I'm talking, if you've got any questions, do keep them in mind, and I'll try and answer as many as I can at the end. So I'm Lucy. I'm currently in London. I'm studying zoology at university, which is basically animal science. And I've always been really passionate about wildlife, but I've always had a particular soft spot for the weirder side of wildlife. So I live in the UK. We haven't got big animals like bears and things, but I just fell in love with the insects and the weird things and the small things that I could find out in my back garden. And I have always had this passion for weird wildlife, and now one of my favorite weird animals is, of course, the sloth. And the reason that I love them so much is because of my job. So I work as the digital content producer for the Sloth Appreciation Society. And so I spend a lot of my time researching sloths and reading about them, talking to people about sloths online, just trying to teach people about how cool they are, basically. And I also make videos about them. I've spent time working with them out in Panama, and I try and teach people about their biology and their ecology, so the way that their bodies work and how they interact with the wildlife around them, the world around them, but also about their conservation. So, are they threatened? Are they endangered? What sort of challenges do they face, and how can we help them? So that's enough about me. I'm going to start with a challenge. So I've got a leaf here. Now, I went outside and I picked this just from outside in the forest outside. And this isn't obviously the type of leaf that a sloth would eat in the wild, because I'm in the UK. They live in the tropical forests of Central and South America, but it's pretty similar. And what I want you to guess, and we'll be coming back to this later, is how long do you think it takes a sloth to digest a leaf like this? How long do you think it will take them? Just one thin leaf. You can leave your answers maybe in the comments, or take a guess at the end. Maybe just think or discuss with the person next to you what you think the answer is. And your guess can be in days, it can be in weeks, in months maybe. We know these animals are slow, but how long do you think it would take them to digest this? We'll be coming back to that a bit later on. So on to sloths then. There are two main groups of sloth. And you might think, when you hear the word sloth, that it's one type of animal. You think of one big group of animals, but there are two distinct groups, and there are 6 species spread across these groups. But we're going to start with the groups first. So the first group is the Colupus, or two-toed sloths. And then you've got the second group, which is the Adaptation, three-toed sloth. Now, how can you tell them apart? One's two-toed, one's three-toed. You count the number of claws that they have, not on their back paws, because both of them have 3 claws on each of their back paws. But if you look at their front paws, that's where you can see the difference. So the two-toed sloths have 2 claws on each of their front paws, and the three-toed sloths have 3 claws on each of their front paws. But there are other ways that you can tell the difference between the two. And I've got a picture of a two-toed sloth here. And I've also got a picture of a three-toed sloth. You can see the difference there in their noses. So this two-toed sloth has this big pig-like nose almost, whereas this one's got a small button nose, and it's also got those dark eye bands that you can see there, whereas the two-toed sloth doesn't have these. Another difference that you can't see in these pictures, aside from their claws and their faces, are their tails. So the two-toed sloths don't have a visible tail, and the three-toed sloths do. So that's how you tell the difference between the two groups. And even though they have very, very similar lifestyles, they behave in pretty much the same way, they've actually evolved separately, and they are as genetically different as cats and dogs are. And us humans actually have more in common with baboons than those two groups of sloth do to each other. And as I mentioned, there are 6 species of sloth. 4 of them belong to the three-toed group, and 2 of them belong to the two-toed group. So we're going to whiz through a few of those species, and maybe you can pick a favourite while I'm doing that. So the first of the two-toed sloths is this. It's the Colupus two-toed sloth, and this is the most abundant of all the species. So these are the most sort of numerous of all the sloths, and you can see that pig-like snout there. And then quite similar to that is the Linnaeus' two-toed sloth. This is the second species. And the difference between this one and the one that I just showed you mainly is the skin colour. They've got much darker fur, and they've got much darker noses and eyes. So that's those. Now moving on to our three-toed sloths. One of the most recognisable, we've seen this one already. This is Bella, the brown-throated sloth. And this is probably the species that you think of when you hear the word sloth. These are the most widespread. So you can find these in lots of different countries across South and Central America. You also have the pale-throated sloth, which is quite similar to the brown-throated, except you can see the difference in the face. This one's got this big creamy yellow facial disc there, and an interesting pattern on its fur as well. And then you've got one of my favourites. I've never seen one of these, but this, the maned sloth. And it looks like somebody's got a coconut and just drawn an angry face on it. So that's the maned sloth. These are quite rare. You can only find these along the eastern coast of Brazil in the Atlantic forests. And then the rarest sloth of them all is the pygmy sloth. This is the 4th species of three-toed sloth. And this one, this picture that I've got here is actually a picture of a brown-throated sloth, so the one that we saw earlier. But the reason I chose this is because brown-throated sloths and pygmy sloths, not only do they look really similar, but this picture here, this cutout, is about to scale with a fully grown adult pygmy sloth. So they are miniature sloths. They don't get much bigger than this. And they're cousins of the brown-throated sloth, but over thousands and thousands of years, they've evolved because they live on a single tiny island off the coast of Panama. And this island broke off from the mainland thousands of years ago, and it took some sloths with it, and they've been shrinking ever since. And so now you're left with these tiny pygmy sloths that are 40% smaller than the brown-throated sloth that you find on the mainland. So those are the sloth species, and it's nice to know a bit more about what they are, but a question that I get asked a lot is, why are sloths so slow? In fact, some people say to me, what's the point in them? Because people think they just spend all their time sleeping and they're just so slow. What do they do, and why? Why are they so sluggish? Well, they might look a bit lazy to us, but this slothful nature, the fact that they're so slow, is actually the secret to their success. And the reason they're so slow is all to do with their diets. So we're going to go back to the leaf now. You might already know that most of their diets consist of leaves like this one, and you can imagine that this isn't very filling. If you eat a big bowl of salad or spinach or something, it doesn't fill you up very quickly. There isn't a lot of energy in leaves like this, and so the sloths have had to kind of evolve ways to try and conserve energy. You might think, well, why can't they just eat more leaves? If they eat more leaves, they can get more energy. But those leaves are actually really, really tough to digest, and they're also packed full of toxins. And if the sloth ate loads of those leaves, because their digestive systems are so slow, their livers wouldn't have time to process all those toxins and break them down, and so the sloth could actually poison itself. So it can't eat many of these. It sticks to leaves, but it sticks to very few of them. And as I say, they end up getting barely any energy from these. So a sloth on average will consume about 180 to 200 calories a day, which in human terms is about the same as a packet of crisps. So they've not got a lot of energy, and so their bodies have got all these weird adaptations that help them to conserve it. And we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a few of those. So the first one that they've got is something that we can't see. It's in their muscles. So their muscles are biologically engineered to be up to 15 times more sluggish than the muscles of a similarly sized mammal like a domestic cat. And they also have 50% less muscle mass than a similarly sized mammal. So they have half the muscle of your typical mammal. They also have, now we're going to have a look here at this picture. So I've got a picture of a three-toed sloth skeleton, and it's a bit creepy. It's good for Halloween, but if you take a close look at the claws, you can see there that they're part of the skeleton. Now our fingernails are made of a material called keratin, and if you feel them, they're quite soft, really, and bone, of course, is much stronger. So what's happened to the sloth is, unlike most other mammals, like us and most other mammals, their claws aren't made mainly of this material called keratin. They're made of bone, and this makes them super, super strong, so they can just hang on to branches and just hang there for hours and hours. And you can imagine that hanging around upside down, as sloths do, uses a lot less energy as moving around upright does, like we do. We use a lot of energy moving around upright, and they just hang upside down. So you might think, well, hanging upside down, how do they do it? Because if we hung upside down all day, we would really struggle to eat. We would struggle to drink. We would feel, I don't know if you've ever done a cartwheel or hung upside down and you get a head rush and you feel really, really weird. Well, sloths' bodies are adapted so that they can cope with that. Their blood vessels in their bodies are adapted so that they can circulate blood against the flow of gravity, so they don't get that weird head rush. They can also swallow food against the force of gravity. Their throats are specially adapted to do that. And they've also got inside their bodies these special fibres that help to anchor their organs in place and keep their organs in place. Because if it was hanging upside down, a sloth's big stomach, which is full of slowly digesting leaves, could actually put pressure on their lungs and make it difficult for them to breathe, which is why it's important that their organs can't move around too much in their bodies. So that's another adaptation that they have that allows them to hang around upside down. Going back to that skeleton, you'll notice that it's got a really, really long neck. You can see that there. And an interesting thing about sloths is they have more bones in their neck than even a giraffe. So they have the most neck vertebrae, most neck bones, I think, of any other mammal. Only manatees have the same number as sloths do. And what that enables them to do is it enables them to rotate their heads around 270 degrees, which is about 3/4 of a full circle. So they can spin their heads all the way around. Why is that useful? Well, if they're hanging around and they see a tasty looking leaf over there, instead of having to use loads of energy and move their entire bodies over to the leaf to eat it, they can actually just swivel their heads all the way around and grab it with their mouths, so they don't have to move. And I've mentioned the sleeping. A lot of people think that sloths sleep a lot, but they don't sleep as much as you think. On average, sloths sleep for about 8 to 10 hours a day, which is about the same as a human teenager. So that really emphasizes how important these energy-saving adaptations are, because they don't actually sleep that much. So I mentioned that everything about a sloth is slow, including its rate of digestion. Their metabolisms are really slow, and what that means is every single process that happens inside their bodies happens very slowly, including their digestion. So I asked you to take a guess at how long it would take a sloth to digest a single leaf, just one leaf like this. And I can't see who got it right, but I'm sure I'm sure you've got your guesses in your minds. The correct answer is actually 30 days. It takes a three-toed sloth an entire month to digest a single leaf. And that is how slow they are. That's how slow their bodies work. So while these adaptations might make sloths look a little bit lazy to us, they help them, they turn them into a really successful group of animals. And they are very, very finely attuned to their environments. They're perfectly adapted to the places that they live. And another question that I get asked a lot is, are sloths endangered? And I mentioned how they're so well adapted to their environments, but of course us humans are coming in and we're changing those environments at a very fast rate, and that's when sloths start to struggle. So there are 2 species of sloth out of the 6 that are actually considered endangered. The first one is the maned sloth. I mentioned that it was rare. This has been officially recognised by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as vulnerable to extinction. And then even more endangered is the pygmy sloth. It's critically endangered. Its populations are stable at the moment, which is great news, but the island that it lives on is under pressure because people want to come and they want to use it as a holiday destination. They want to lay down on the beaches and build their hotels and build their casinos and things so that they can go there and have a nice time. But obviously that would involve cutting down the sloth's home, cutting down the mangrove swamps that it lives in to make space for us humans. The good news is there is a group, the Zoological Society of London, are working really, really hard to find out more about this sloth and to protect the sloth. So they're in very good hands, but they are still in trouble. And the other 4 species of sloth aren't officially recognised as endangered, but they are becoming, they're still under threat from human activity, to the point that now their biggest threat it no longer comes from natural predation, so animals like harpy eagles and snakes eating them, but actually from loss of habitat. Now, thanks to my job, I've had the opportunity to get up close and personal with sloths in Panama, as Andrew mentioned earlier. I spent 3 months last summer working and living at a wildlife rescue centre in Panama that specialises in the rescue of 2 types of sloth that live in the country, and it's the Hoffman's 2-toed sloth and the brown-throated sloth. So these are the two sloths that I worked with. And they are incredible species, and while I was there, I managed to learn so much about them, but I also managed to learn a lot about, the things that actually bring them into rescue centres. So a lot of the sloths that are brought into sanctuaries, like the one that I was working at, are either injured or orphaned, and the driving factor in most cases is this habitat loss, and it's a type of habitat loss called habitat fragmentation. And what that means is, imagine you've got a huge patch of forest and there are lots of sloths there, they're all moving around and they've got lots of food and they can mate with each other. Imagine if humans come along and they build a huge road through the middle of it. That then splits that big patch of forest into 2. And suddenly there are fewer sloths, there's fewer food, there's less food because it's harder for them to move around. And you might continue building roads. Maybe people will build some towns as well, some small villages, some areas of housing, or maybe a big factory, and that splits up that habitat, and you end up with all these sort of tiny islands of forest. And it's really hard for an animal like a sloth to move between those patches of habitat because they're so slow, and they're very, very vulnerable when they're down on the ground. And to cross things like roads, they have to climb down to the trees, and it uses a lot of energy. So they tend to just run into trouble if they do try and do that. And with more of this habitat fragmentation, it means that sloths are coming into contact with humans a lot more, and they've got an increased risk of coming into contact with domestic dogs. Sometimes they wander into people's gardens and they end up being attacked by people's dogs. They can get hit by cars. Some of them are actually trying to cross the roads by climbing along the power lines, the electricity power cables, and then they end up being electrocuted, which is not very nice. The good thing is, I guess the good thing is that it doesn't always end up in injury, and some sloths just end up a bit disorientated and a bit confused. They'll wander into an urban area and they'll look around and there's no food there, it's quite loud, it's a completely alien environment. And so there are loads and loads of rescue organisations doing some really important work to go out and to rescue injured and orphaned sloths, and also these disorientated sloths. And when I was in Panama, I actually got to go out and rescue a sloth from somebody's front garden, and we relocated it. So we took it to a patch of forest nearby that was protected, and there were no humans around. It was a huge patch of forest, lots of food, lots of other sloths around, and so we released it and it was perfectly happy there, and it was a really, really great experience. And there are loads of organisations doing this important work, and their main goal is to rescue these sloths and rehabilitate them so that they can return them back into the wild where they belong. So on a lighter note, what was it like being at that place? I actually had the unusual job of acting as a surrogate mum to a bunch of orphaned baby sloths. And you're probably wondering, what was that like? You might think it was easy because sloths do spend a lot of time sleeping, and they don't move around much, but it's actually quite hard to look after baby sloths because they eat a lot. So the sloths that I was looking after would be fed 4 times a day. They'd get four milk feeds, and they'd also be fed tiny pieces of chopped up vegetable 4 times a day as well. And also you'd have to go out and you'd have to collect leaves for them to hang up, and you'd get covered in ants. So they're actually a lot of work to look after. But what you might see is, if you see a picture of baby sloths, here's some baby two-toed sloths here, is you'll see them paired up. Now in the wild, sloths are solitary animals, so they keep themselves to themselves. They don't really like the company of other sloths. But when they're rescued and they're tiny orphan babies, they're often paired up like this. And the reason rescue centres do this is because when baby sloths are born, they will cling on to their mums for up to the first year of their life. And this provides them with protection. It protects them from predators, and obviously they drink their mum's milk as well. So if they end up orphaned, not having anything to hug essentially can make them feel a bit upset and a bit stressed out. So that's why they're paired up. So these two, this is Popcorn and Latte, and you can see they're cuddle buddies, and they are inseparable. When you pair up 2 orphan baby sloths, they do everything together. They eat together, they exercise together, they sleep together. It's really, really cute. And it's okay for sloths to hug each other. It's less of a good idea for humans to hug sloths, because sloths are really, really sensitive to stress, and so they don't like human contact. It's best to sort of love them from a distance, and leave them to get on with their wild lives up in the trees. They're also very feisty. The two-toed sloths, they've got really sharp teeth. They're like fangs. They're called pseudo-canines, and they're really, really sharp, and they've got those sharp, strong claws that I mentioned earlier as well. So it's really important that we keep learning about sloths and find out about, tell people about how weird and how cool they are, and also it's important that we know enough about them to be able to protect them and protect their habitats. And when we protect one species, we're also protecting the animals that rely on it, and the animals and the plants that it interacts with, because everything is linked in an ecosystem. So the sloth, when we talk about animals that depend on the sloth, we're not just talking about predators, about animals that eat sloths, like jaguars and pumas and snakes, But there's also a type of insect that actually lives on the sloth. It's called a sloth moth, and it can be found living absolutely nowhere else apart from on the fur of sloths. And I was told that there are different types of sloth moth that live on the different species of sloth. So they're really, really specialized. So you might be thinking that you want to do something to help sloths now that you've heard about some of the problems that they're facing and learn a bit about them. There's a way that you can do that. I'm involved in with a conservation organisation called Reserva, the Youth Land Trust, and they are working to create the world's first entirely youth-funded nature reserve. They're creating a network of youth-funded nature reserves across the globe, and our very first site is actually in Ecuador, so it's very close to Panama, where I met those sloths, and it's home to Hoffman's two-toed sloths, and we've just found out that there are also three-toed sloths living on the site as well. And we've got a campaign called the 1 Million Letters campaign. And what we're asking you to do is to write a letter. It can be a very, very informal letter. You might even want to draw a picture on there or write a poem, anything. You can get super creative with it. But write a letter and explain why you love nature. And you can maybe use what you've learned today and talk about why you think sloths are interesting, why you like sloths. And then after you've explained why you love nature, you write a bit about why you think it's important that we protect it. And every single letter that we get will be matched with a donation of $3. And that will go into our reserve project. And $3 might not sound like a lot to some of you, but if you look around, $3 at the moment is enough to save a classroom-sized patch of rainforest. Imagine how many sloths you could pack into your classroom. You could save that area of habitat, which is also home to frogs and pumas and bears, just by writing a letter. So you can head over to the website that you can see in the banner just down there and find out a bit more about how you can get involved with that. So yeah, that's everything from me and the sloth. So now it's over to you to ask me some questions if you have any.
All right, thank you so much. We'll bring in Madame Champagne's class. Do you guys have any questions? I think you're muted. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Come on, Lachlan. So, do sloths stay in the same habitat for their whole lives, or do they change their habitats?
Okay, that's a good one. So sloths, I think they do move around. They have their territories. So they stay in one spot more or less, but they will move around. And I think their ranges, so the area that they cover, is about the size of 5 soccer fields, I think, 5 or 6 soccer fields. So they do move quite a distance, but the only place that you can find sloths are in the tropical forests of Central and South America, except the Pygmy sloth. So you can find that on that island, and it lives in the mangrove swamps. So they're kind of swampy forests, a certain type of tree called a mangrove, and it feeds on the mangrove leaves. But all the other species just live in the tropical forests in Central and South America.
All right, awesome. We'll bring in Miss Doofer's class now for a question.
Hi, my name is Jackson, and my question is, can sloths ever be pets?
That's a really, really good question. So a lot of people see sloths and they see that they hug and they're all cuddly and they're furry, and I mean, they're really, really cute, aren't they? But sloths shouldn't really be pets, because I've already spoken about their sharp claws and their sharp teeth, and they can be very unpredictable. And I mentioned the fact that they're very, very sensitive to stress. And sloths in the wild wouldn't really interact with humans. They wouldn't see humans. They wouldn't come close to humans unless humans came into their territory. So usually sloths are stressed by us humans. So having one as a pet could make it stressed. Also, they're used to living in hot rainforests. So if you took a sloth and you put it in your front room or in your bedroom, that's not really the place that it's most suited to. And also it's really, really hard to provide the right food for them as well. So even sloth experts who work to rescue sloths out in Central America and South America are still working out what is the best diet to give them to make sure that they grow up to be big and strong.
All right, awesome. Sounds like sloths are better cuddle buddies for each other than for humans.
Yeah, it's good they love cuddling each other, but they don't like cuddling humans, so.
All right, Mr. Pregler's class, do you guys have a question?
Yep. Priya.
How long do the sloth's nails grow?
Well, sloth claws, actually, a fun fact about sloth claws is that they never stop growing. But obviously they get worn down by all that climbing that they do. So the three-toed sloth, I know their claws grow to they can grow to up to 10 centimeters long, I think, which is pretty long. But they never stop growing. It's just that they're worn down by all the climbing.
All right, awesome. We will ask Ms. Keller's class if you guys have a question now.
So I heard that some sloths are kind of like slimy. Is that true?
Sorry, say that again?
So I heard that some sloths are like kind of like slimy. Is that true? Or
so sloths don't feel slimy. They feel I have actually had the chance to hold a sloth. I got to take a sloth outside for its exercise. It was one that was injured, and their fur is quite sort of bristly, quite rough feeling. But the idea that they're slimy probably comes from the fact that you sometimes see pictures of sloths, and they're green. They're a greeny colour, and that's because they have algae that grows in their fur. The strands of fur on a sloth have ridges in them. They're bumpy, they have grooves, and those little grooves collect water, and that means that it creates the perfect place for algae to grow. And so their fur ends up, it's like a miniature garden. So they grow all this algae, and then they get the sloth moths. The sloth moths move in, and you get some beetles, but it doesn't actually make the sloths slimy, although they are covered in algae.
All right, interesting. We have a question from class 9E.
Hi, how do sloths protect their territory?
Okay, so sloths generally try and they're not very social animals, so they'll keep themselves to themselves. But sometimes a male, it's usually the males that defend the territories, will wander in. They will fight. They have those sharp claws and sharp teeth to defend themselves against predators, but to also fight off other sloths that might invade their territories. And I also found out today that male sloths will also guard a female that they've mated with for a number of days before moving off.
All right, very cool. Let's see if we have a question from Mrs. Gordson's class. I think you guys are a bit frozen. If you'd like to type your question in the private chat, you're welcome to do so.
Somebody asked there if sloths can hold their breath. I don't know if they can hold their breath, but they are surprisingly good swimmers. They're 3 times faster in the water as they are on land.
I don't know. Don't know why. There, I think she sees it now.
Yep, we can see you guys now if you'd like to ask a question. I think the connection might not be strong enough. If you'd like to Oh, they put in the chat, what is the most interesting thing you've seen or done at work? Great question.
Ooh, I mean, so the most interesting thing and the most exciting thing was actually working with the sloths out in Panama. But to be more specific, I think releasing sloths is always really exciting. So sometimes they were sloths that, like the one that we rescued from somebody's front garden. Sometimes they were just disorientated and confused. Some of them had actually been there for a while, and they'd been there for a few months recovering from injuries. Maybe they'd fallen from the trees and broken a bone or something. But there were a few sloths that I actually got to take out into the forest and release, and that is always so much fun to see them go back into the wild where they belong, and also just how at home they are. And as soon as you open up the crate that they're in, they just come straight out and they climb right up into the canopy. They know exactly what to do.
That sounds super rewarding. We will ask a few questions from the YouTube comments. Okay. So we've had quite a few questions about what sloths' lifespans are like.
Yeah, that's a good one. And there are a lot of questions that scientists still don't know the answer to. So the oldest known two-toed sloth is one that was reared in captivity. And her name is Paula. She's a Hoffman's two-toed sloth. And I think she recently celebrated her 52nd birthday or something. But nobody actually knows how long sloths live for in the wild, because they're so well camouflaged, and they're so elusive and mysterious. Nobody's actually followed one from birth until death, so they just don't know. But it's thought that in the wild, sloths may live even longer than those captive sloths, because in captivity they're fed diets that are, a lot of vegetables, so they're unnaturally high in sugars, and also they're around humans, so they can be exposed to a lot more stress. So it could be that wild sloths live for longer than 50 years. I mean, maybe there's a 100-year-old sloth out there somewhere, but nobody knows yet.
Wow. Another question. What is your favorite type of sloth?
Oh, this is really hard to answer. I mean, I've never seen one, but I just love how the mane sloth looks, because sloths are weird anyway, but this one looks really, really weird. And if I had to choose between the two-toed sloths and the three-toed sloths, I don't think I could. I just can't. They're so different. And I think everybody thinks of the three-toed sloths when they think of sloths, and they are very, very cute. But also the two-toed sloth is a kind of underrated group of sloths, I think.
That's definitely a tough question. Another question, how good is a sloth's eyesight?
Okay, I don't remember the specifics of this, but I know that their eyesight is actually quite poor. They've got a different sort of structure inside their eye to what most other mammals do. It's all to do with the types of cells that they have. So they don't see very well at all. They're not completely blind. There is a myth that goes around that says they're almost blind. They can see, but they rely mainly on their sense of smell to get around.
All right, and another question from YouTube. Are sloths good swimmers?
Yep, they are. They're really good swimmers, and most people are surprised about that. They can move 3 times faster in the water than they can on land. So the pygmy sloth in particular, some of you might have seen a video. There's quite a popular video of a sloth swimming to get to its mate, and those long arms are just perfect for swimming. And because they're full of their stomachs are full of slowly digesting leaves, what's happening with those leaves is they're basically slowly fermenting, essentially. So they give off all this kind of gas. So the sloths are really, really buoyant. They can float around in water. So that, and the fact that they've got those long arms, makes them really, really good swimmers.
All right, awesome. I think we have time for one more question for each of our camera spots. So, Madame Champagne, do you guys have another question?
Do sloths ever fall from trees?
So they do fall. There was some research that was done fairly recently, and I think they worked out that on average a sloth will fall from the trees about once a week. So they fall a lot, but they've actually got an extra set of ribs. They've got their bodies are really, really hardy. They can recover from injury really, really well. They can get horrible injuries, but they can still recover. And nobody really knows why exactly. They think it might be down to their slow metabolism, so how their body just works really, really slowly. It helps them to heal from injury, but they're very hardy, and those extra ribs protect them from things like falls. And if a baby sloth falls, often the mum will just come down and collect it, and the baby will climb back onto its mum, and they'll just carry on. But yeah, they do fall.
All right, Mrs. Stufer's class, do you guys have another question?
Hi, my name is Milani, and I have a question. When sloths are born, do the mother just leave them, or do they take care of them until they're old enough to go on their own?
Yeah, so sloths are actually really, really good mums. They will have their baby, and the baby will cling on to its mum's belly for up to the first year of its life. It's the first 6 months, to the first year of its life. And in that time, it will feed on the mum's milk. And from the age of about a week old, the mum will also start to give the baby small pieces of leaf from its mouth so that it can learn what sort of plants are safe to eat and what's not safe to eat. And then once the baby is big enough and it's started to explore the canopy and it can climb and feed itself, the mum will then leave its territory to the baby, and she'll go off and find a new one. So the baby gets a lot of care, and it also gets a nice patch of forest to live in as well.
All right, Mr. Pregler's class, do you have another question?
Yep.
Do sloths eat anything else than leaves?
So one type of thing that's really, really, really popular with sloths is a flower called a hibiscus flower. It's a big pink tropical flower, and it's like sloth chocolate. They absolutely love them. They're a sweet treat for sloths. But yeah, mainly they just feed on leaves, and the three-toed sloths are a lot fussier than the two-toed sloths. There are only a handful of tree species whose leaves they'll actually eat, whereas the two-toed sloth is a lot more flexible. It's a lot less fussy.
All right. Does Ms. Keller's class have another question?
Yeah. Are sloths related to monkeys?
A lot of people think that sloths are related to monkeys, and you would understand why, because they're such great climbers and they live up in the trees. So it's a really good guess. But the truth is even more surprising, because they're actually related to anteaters and armadillos. So they belong to a family called the xenarthrans. And if you have a look at a picture of an anteater, maybe your teacher can show you one after, have a look at its claws, and then have a look at the claws on a sloth, and you'll see they're very, very similar. So if you pay attention to those small details, you'll begin to understand and begin to see how they might be related.
All right, interesting. So Mrs. Gortson's class, do you guys have a question? Oh, they typed their question in the chat. So what is your favorite sloth adaptation? They're studying adaptations in science right now.
That's a really, really hard one. I like the fact that their claws are made of bone, just because it's such a weird one, and I think it's a great one for this time of year as well, for Halloween. It's a spooky sloth fact, the fact that because the claws are basically extra long finger bones that stick out of the tops of their paws, which I think is really, really cool. And also that's essential to them being able to hang around upside down, which is what they're famous for.
All right, that definitely makes sloths super unique. Last but not least, let's take a question from class 9E.
What are the predators of a sloth?
So sloths, one of the main predators of the sloth, I'm going to focus on one, is the Harpy Eagle. And if you have a look at pictures of it, it's a really scary looking. I wouldn't want to be faced with a Harpy Eagle if I was a sloth. It's this big grey eagle. It's got this huge ring of feathers around its face that focus sound. It catches sound so they can hear. They've got such great hearing, so they can hear the leaves rustling around, and they'll just swoop and pick the sloth out of the tree. And that's another good thing about a sloth being so slow, is because they move so slowly, they can often slip under the radar of predators, but they'll also get eaten by ground-based predators as well, because sloths actually come down to the ground once a week to go to the toilet. They only go to the toilet once a week because, as I mentioned, their digestive systems are so slow. But they'll come down to the ground and poop at the base of a tree, which is quite an unusual thing. And nobody knows why they do that, because, as I said, it makes them really vulnerable to predators. And I think something like 1/3 to 1/2 of all sloth deaths happen when they're actually down on the ground doing their business. So why they do it, what the benefit is, we don't know yet.
All right, really awesome questions today. Thank you so much, Lucy, for joining us and teaching us all about sloths. And thank you to all of our classrooms who tuned in. Make sure that you all write your letters to Reserva. I will put the website back up again now. And that's a wrap, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for all your questions as well. Some really good ones in there.